Hello, I'm Amy Hawthorne, Deputy Director for Research at the Project on Middle East Democracy, or POMED. And I'm here today with Scott Williamson, Assistant Professor at Bocconi University in Milan. Scott is the author of a new POMED report titled Popular Politics in Egypt, From the 2011 Revolution to al-Sisi's Authoritarian Revival. What do political scientists say? In which he summarizes the findings of dozens of works of political science scholarship, 67 works to be exact, about Egypt's tumultuous 2011 to 2014 period. And this period, as you'll remember, encompasses the January 25th, 2011 popular uprising that ousted President Hosni Mubarak, the 2.5-year democratic opening that followed, and the July 2013 military coup against the elected government, and the consolidation of authoritarian rule by then Defense Minister, now President, Abdel Fattah al-Sisi. This was one of the most important and momentous periods of Egypt's modern history. And Scott, I'd like to pose 3 questions to you about your report. The first is, tell us about how you chose the 67 scholarly sources that you read for this paper. What works did you focus on and why?
Thanks, Amy. So first, in terms of why I wanted to write a report highlighting findings from this academic research, I think it's clear that there's been a lot of heavily politicized and biased writing about Egyptian politics during this time period. And so for that reason, I thought it was important to highlight what dozens of scholars have been writing about Egyptian politics during the transition from an objective standpoint. And because there is so much great scholarly work now on this time period, it was difficult to narrow it down. But for me, I really wanted to focus on popular politics during this period. And by that, I mean what everyday Egyptians were thinking, their political opinions, and how they interacted with and involved themselves in politics. And that was for 2 reasons. First, because the opinions and actions of everyday Egyptians really did matter for the country's political trajectory during this time period, and perhaps more so than at most other moments in Egypt's modern history. And second, because for political reasons, a lot of different people and political actors have made claims about what it is that the Egyptian public wanted or thought, but often without much evidence. And so I wanted to try and draw on the academic literature to explore what those findings say about what Egyptians were thinking and doing at this time. I will say that I did prioritize studies using quantitative methods and statistical analysis. And that was primarily because I thought these studies might be less accessible to non-academics.
Thanks, Scott. My second question is, what were 1 or 2 of the most interesting or surprising explanations that you read in these scholarly works of what happened in Egypt in the 2011 to 2014 transition period?
Sure. So one of the most interesting explanations about the success of the 2011 uprising has to do with the importance of protesters using violence against the police. We tend to think about the Egyptian revolution as a case where nonviolent demonstrators overcame this very violent authoritarian state. And to a large extent, that is accurate. But what actually happened is somewhat more complicated than that. So in his book, Neil Ketchley documents how protesters attacked and burned dozens of police stations in the opening days of the uprising. And this was important because it really broke the ability of the police to contain the demonstrators, and it meant that people felt more safe or safer to go out and take to the streets and protest against Mubarak. It also meant that Mubarak was then dependent on the military to try and repress the demonstrations, but the conscript soldiers' loyalty was in question. And so suddenly, within days, the regime finds itself on very shaky grounds in terms of its ability to repress and contain the protests. And I think that this finding is an important reminder that even in mostly nonviolent revolutions, there often is an important role for coercion on the part of the demonstrators. Another important finding comes from Roy Truex and Dan Tivana, who studied Egyptians' attitudes towards al-Sisi in 2016, a couple of years after the coup. And they did this using a method designed explicitly to study how people think about sensitive topics, for instance, attitudes towards a violent and repressive dictator like al-Sisi. And what they found is that a majority of Egyptians, at least at the time they did their study in 2016, did have positive attitudes towards al-Sisi. It was approximately 60%. These positive attitudes were more pronounced among Egyptians, sometimes described as secular or liberal. And I think these findings are an important reminder that autocrats can be genuinely popular, and that al-Sisi likely was, at least for a few years after the 2013 coup. Of course, that may have changed by now. And for those who care about democracy and human rights, I think it's important to recognize this, and then also to understand why people may come to hold these views if you're then going to convince them to change their minds.
Thanks, Scott. And my third and final question for you is, what does a deeper understanding of this 2011 to 2014 period in Egypt, as well as other literature that you've read, suggest about what might trigger a new uprising in Egypt and how a second transition might play out?
So we know from opinion polling that most Egyptians still want to be governed by a democracy. But that's probably not enough based on what happened with the initial revolution and other academic literature to lead to another uprising. If al-Sisi does face mass opposition in the future, economic grievances are likely to play a really important role in triggering mass opposition. On a somewhat pessimistic note, the structure of al-Sisi's regime, with so much power concentrated in the presidency, suggests that he is less likely to concede relatively peacefully, as happened with Mubarak in 2011, and that he's much more likely to go down fighting so that we would see violence as we did in the aftermath of the 2013 coup. And unfortunately, in addition to the violence, these bloodier revolutions also are less likely to lead to democracy afterwards because they destabilize the transition that follows. And that implies that Egyptians will face a difficult path if another uprising occurs in the future. However, that being said, as the 2019 protest movements in Algeria and Sudan illustrated, the region's activists have proven that they can learn and adapt to changing situations in their countries. And so in terms of Egypt, if another uprising does occur, I think what will be really important is to figure out how to maintain a united front across the various opposition groups against the military. Doing so will be crucial to ensure a more democratic outcome the next time around.
Thank you, Scott. Thank you for ending on a note of a slight optimism there. I've been here with Scott Williamson, Professor Scott Williamson, Professor of Political Science at Bocconi University, author of the new POMED report, Popular Politics in Egypt, From the 2011 Revolution to al-Sisi's Authoritarian Revival. What do political scientists say? And this report is available on our website, pomed.org. Thank you, Scott.
Thank you.